Hi, Tom. Thanks for joining me today on the art of developer experience.
Oh, thank you for having me.
To get started, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your journey into technology?
So I'm Tom. I'm the founder and CEO of Svix, and we do webhook sending as a service. I've been coding for a while now. I first started when I was 9 years old. Back then actually it was a lot of fun. I missed the old internet. Like everything was hackable. You would go to the store and buy a book about like six assembly, and that's kind of like how you would learn anything. Maybe you'll Alta Vista a bit to get stuff, but other than that, it was it was just great. Like open possibilities. I discovered Linux and started hacking on that. And then I'm going to make an esoteric reference that I'm sure no one knows, OpenMoko. That was like an open source software, open source hardware mobile phone that existed before Android, before the iPhone, fully hackable, runs Linux, never worked. But it was a lot of fun. Like it's kind of like was my really, that's really how I got into like software engineering. Because before that, I would used to, I used to write like small programs, or maybe I made some like open source contributions. But with this one, I actually got neck deep into hacking on it, and that actually got me into Samsung. And they saw my open source work, and they were working on their own a Linux based phone. It was called, back then it was called Samsung Linux Platform or something like that. Then it changed its name to Tizen. Maybe you've heard of that one.
Sure, I remember that one.
Yeah, so I think they just deprecated it last year or something, but it had a good run, and they saw my open source work on the OpenMocha thing, and they hired me to work on Samsung on the Samsung platform, and that's kind of like how I got into software in general, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty common story that people who get into technology are pursuing things that they're curious about or that they're passionate about, and then a company might notice the work that you're putting out into the world and want to bring you in house. So I definitely have heard that story before. Um, I'm wondering though, you're working with Svix now that this company you've started, which is really focused on webhooks. And I'm just wondering, maybe we could start by just you sharing like what are webhooks and why they're useful for anyone on the podcast who aren't really clear, like why do I need webhooks as part of my API stack?
Yeah, no, happy to. I think what was very interesting to me is that webhooks, just based on the name, it sounds like a familiar name. It sounds like something everyone would know, but actually, it's surprising like how esoteric they are still to this day, even though they power most of the APIs we all use. So webhooks are essentially HTTP callbacks, or maybe you can call them a reverse API. So if you consider like any API service that you use every day, let's say Twilio for sending SMS. When you make an API call to Twilio to send an SMS, you'd give the number, maybe the message, and then Twilio will send it on your behalf. Great, easy. That's an API. We all know and love that. But what happens when you want to see the response, like someone that received your SMS that you decide to reply to it? How do you know that someone replied to your SMS? So like one way to do it is to pull the Twilio API. Just check every second or multiple times a second. Hey, Twilio, did I get a new message? No. Did I get a new message? No. And multiply that by, the 1,000 or 10,000 phone numbers that you're probably using on Twitter, it just becomes unsustainable. And the alternative is webhooks. It's a callback. So whenever Twilio receives an SMS on your behalf, they just make an HTTP callback that just hits your service like any other HTTP call. And that's how you know when something happened. That's kind of like the event-driven part of the API, essentially.
Yeah. I I think like you, I've been around on the internet for a little bit for a while now, and I remember they had the term long polling, which was sort of I need to figure out some kind of interval to call this API every 30 seconds, every 5 minutes, whatever the developer thought was reasonable. What's the downside of that for the API provider?
Yeah, so let's start with short polling for a second, just because, to have the full picture. So short polling is essentially you check, and then immediately the API responds with the response, whether there's something there or not. That's again grossly inefficient because you have to just check all the time in order to get up-to-date information. Long polling is essentially you making that request and then keeping the connection open until something happens, and then the API service will notify you. The problem is that it also becomes it goes out of control as well fairly quickly, because all of a sudden the API provider needs to maintain a lot of open connections, which can be costly both on terms of, the load balancer performance, but also just like open sockets. It just becomes this like whole mess, as well as sometimes not being reliable, because you have to maintain that connection to stay alive, to make sure it's not disconnected. And so you would actually, it feels more real time because you have a connection open, but actually in practice, it won't be as real time as a webhook or other methods if the connection dies or times out in between.
Got it. Got it. How did you come across this idea that webhooks could be a service or needed to be a service for some companies versus building it in-house, which is how a lot of people do, build their APIs by, using their own teams and resources?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you it was some, like apple falling on my head, Newton kind of moment. But it really, at my previous company, people asking us for webhooks, and we kind of like looked into building it, and we realized it's going to be a lot of work. We just, we don't have time and resources to do it. So we said no. And then people came back, and more people came again and asked us again for webhooks. And we figured, okay, we can probably find the time, allocate the time to build a service. But what happens about, what about maintenance and ongoing maintenance and adding functionality and supporting all of that? So we realized it's actually much more of it's much bigger lift than just the initial build. So we said no again. And then people kept on asking us still, and then we realized, what, we can find the time to build it. We can allocate the resources to maintain it. But we have this like beautiful API, right? We're not going to have a terrible webhook experience. So we probably need to multiply the first two by like 2x or 3x. And we just realized, we said no again. Like we realized we can't do it. We told people just to pull the API. And I wish I was smart enough to realize at that point that there was a business there. But it was only like a few months later. And a friend of mine asked, a few silly questions about webhooks in a Slack community we're both members of. And I started like answering and explaining this and that, and this is what you need to do. And I realized she couldn't care less about any of my answers. And all she wanted was to send webhooks and not have to think about it. And I remembered, I know another guy that had the same problem, me a few months prior, and I asked her like, hey, if I build you a product that does this, so will you pay me? And she's just like, hell yeah. And then someone else jumped in like, yeah, we'll pay you as well. And someone else, said like, we don't need webhooks at the moment. Previous company was a big hassle. Happy to introduce you. By the way, spoiler alert, she never paid us. She never became a customer. But the rest did. The other few people from the thread did. And it really kind of just like grew from that, so I knew we had the problem as like, as like a small startup, like from a previous company. And I knew she had the problem as a small startup. I didn't realize it was going to be a problem that enterprises also face and fast growing startups as well. And it just really just evolved with time. We just built the product and people started coming. And then we started doing outreach, and then, we realized more people care about the problem. And that's kind of like how it just evolved.
Interesting. So a pretty quick validation of the idea. Now, going into this, your original thesis was that smaller companies or smaller teams are the ones struggling to build webhooks. How is that actually materialized for you? Are you finding that all types of companies, or have you found like sort of an ideal situation where your service is like the perfect fit for that kind of company?
So today we power the webhooks from 2-person or 1-person startups all the way to the Fortune 50. And it's, we kind of like, when you use Svix, you benefit from a few, we kind of add value in a few different ways. One, if you don't have webhooks already, your time to market is nothing. It's very fast to go to and start offering webhooks. So that's valuable for both small startups and larger companies. If they, there's a deal waiting to be signed and the only thing blocking it is the webhooks, and they can really benefit from that. But the other thing that we help with is, the ongoing maintenance and scale and all of those, which again, like larger companies suffer from that as well. The larger the scale, the larger the hassle. So it's really, we really see the adoption throughout that curve. It's not, if anything, more in the middle of the curve. Like I think, like 1,000 people companies, they like really love Svix. But we also, again, have like very happy customers, as I said, all the way down and all the way up.
Yeah. So it sounds like you solve a couple problems, both the time to release of this feature, and then if the product's a huge hit and there's tons of webhooks being distributed, then you folks offer that scaling piece of it that relieves that responsibility off of your customers as well, right?
Exactly. And one thing as well that I haven't mentioned is kind of like when I mentioned, why we said no to building webhooks in the first place was the developer experience as well. One thing that we see is that people build awesome, scalable, webhooks systems, but no one uses them. Because if you don't make it very easy for people to consume the webhooks, they're just not going to subscribe. They're not going to start using them. And then, it doesn't matter how scalable it is if no one comes and, and uses it. So,
Yeah. So that leads us into the topic of the podcast, which is developer experience. So I'm wondering, how do you personally define developer experience, and why do you think it's so important to a product success?
yeah, I mean, our customers are developers. I'm going to go very little here, but our customers are developers. And the experience is how they experience the product, right? So it's really just about making our customers happy. And it comes, I sometimes see people define developer experience very narrowly. And they say, you have to have a great API, maybe docs, or maybe something that's like very specific. But the way we see it is really the holistic way that people interact with Svix, the company, and the service. And so that means, we have to have great APIs, and we also have to have great SDKs. We have to have great docs, but we also have to have great support, fast support as well. Because I think, one of the most frustrating things, I mean, at least for me, I don't know if it applies to every engineer, is that when you're in the middle of something, you're in the flow and you have an issue, you want to solve it now. You don't want to solve it 3 days from now. And definitely you don't want to get a response from like a non-engineer that send you to a link to an irrelevant doc page, right? So I think really everything, all the surface area where engineers interact with your company is part of the developer experience, in my point of view. And we try to, or we work hard on polishing every part of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think support is an area that I haven't really delved into with any of my guests. So I'm curious. We all try to make really great self-service documentation and SDKs that have intuitive naming conventions. But when it comes to support, what is Svix offering that you think helps you get past that obstacle of a developer sending off a message and getting an incomplete or maybe poor response? Or are there virtual communities that you're building for your developers? I'm wondering where you've gone with that.
So let me first actually give you an anecdote from the early days of Svix, and then I'm going to answer this question. Back when we started, or the first 12 months, or maybe even longer than that, I had my phone on noise throughout the night as well, and it would beep very loudly if someone asked a question in the Slack community. Usually it was fine because, like most people work roughly in the time zones that I was working in. But sometimes I would be woken up and I would immediately jump in and answer that question. Why? Because again, like I want them to be able to solve their problem immediately. And we're trying to, not to this extreme anymore. I need my sleep nowadays, but we tried, to have like around the sun coverage of our Slack community. We respond quickly. We have engineers. We don't have, like an offshore team that tries to, triage issues. It's only engineers. And I think really what we do very well is that every time there's an issue, every time there's something that's wrong, we try to improve the docs and we try to improve the product to make sure that this set of questions won't be asked ever again. And that actually made it so that the support burden is actually very reasonable for like a team of engineers to support. It's not, it's not like every time we add a customer, add 10% of support. It actually support stays fairly stable over time. And so that's how we manage to maintain it.
Yeah, I think that's terrific advice. I think going beyond just answering that one developer's question, but trying to figure out what was the gap in the documentation, or what did they trip over that resulted in them having to reach out to the community and to support to get that help, and how can we try to smooth that surface for the rest of the developers that come after them. I think that's terrific to hear. You mentioned docs. What do you think makes documentation useful rather than just a formality? And how do you think engineers can produce better documentation for an API, let's just say, or a developer tool?
So I think the problem, when I think about docs, I kind of go back to university. And what they taught us, I don't know if they still do it, I hope not. But it's just like you have to add a doc line to like literally every line of code. You just like a lot of docs that mean nothing, do nothing, but you got full grade, 100% grade on the documentation part because you documented every line. And I think this is the approach that a lot of people do. They either have this like linting rule that makes sure that you have to document every function, or they have some internal policy that you have to always write docs. And that's great. You should always have the docs, but it really misses the mark, which is docs are useless. No one cares about docs. People care about achieving what they want. People care about using the API. If the API was just magic and you wouldn't need the doc, that's great. That's better than docs. Like, we don't need the docs. So I think the difference between good docs and bad docs is recognizing that and just focusing on what your customers are trying to achieve and unlocking that rather than describing what this is. And I guess, like, actually another related thing that I see a lot is people writing docs from their own perspective instead of the customer's perspective.
Yes.
So, I mean, one thing is obviously the curse of knowledge, you know much more. But the other one is that, like, even terminology, this is, we send webhooks and receive API and send outbound. Like, using the terminology from the customer's perspective is really important, but also just from what the customer is trying to achieve and what this actually means for them, rather than documenting whatever is going through the engineer's mind at that point in time.
Yeah. Is there anything that you do specifically to cultivate this culture among your engineering teams to reinforce that mindset of putting themselves in the customer's perspective or creating docs that are useful? Like, is there any tricks that we can offer the audience?
If there are any tricks, I haven't found them. What I just do is reiterate that all the time. And we talked about it earlier. When we see something is not great because we see a customer like tripping on it, we improve it. So it's really just about iteration and being, with your fingers on the pulse and just repeating to the team and to yourself that your perspective doesn't matter. What matters is the perspective of the customer and the developer.
So Svix has been recognized multiple times for their developer experience. What do you think that Svix is doing in how you engage your customers and onboard them onto your product?
Yeah. So I think it really relates to what we talked about earlier, which is just looking at everything from the customer's perspective. And that, I'm going to give you more examples and see how that manifests. But let's assume, I'm a new customer. I'm coming to Svix, right? I mean, maybe I looked at the website. Maybe I've used it before from the other end, from the consumer side. Maybe I even heard good things about it. But at the end of the day, I know nothing about Svix. I'm here for a reason. I'm here to send webhooks. So the most important thing for us, like when someone signs up to Svix, is get them to send a webhook. So the onboarding wizard is really just tailored around that. We could make it shorter, by the way. We have some but we make it slightly, we make it really, it's really, okay. We spend a lot of time on the onboarding wizard without going too deep into a tangent. And it's really just, having the right amount of API calls, doing the right amount of work. And I think our onboarding wizard at the moment is 2 API calls that you just copy paste into the terminal and run them. And after that, we kind of celebrate the fact that you've now integrated Svix. Svix does much more than just these 2 API calls. But I think that milestone of understanding of achieving what you are trying to achieve, I think is extremely important. And the other one is really just meeting engineers where they are. So, we've had since day one, we've had SDKs for a variety of languages like Python and async Python and sync Python and JavaScript and TypeScript and Kotlin and, Java and C# and Rust and Ruby and a very long list of languages. And it's because, people want everything to be easy, and rightfully so. They don't have the mental capacity to go and every website they visit to do a PhD on it and, read thousands of pages of docs, see videos, all of that. You really just want to get them. You want to make it super easy for them to achieve what they came to achieve.
Yeah. Is there anything you do to measure your DX, like the number of customers that are onboarding with an SDK versus decide to roll their own solution? Is that something that you guys track, or are there other things that you measure that are like KPIs that indicate that you're finding success, like less tickets or more advanced tickets, or as far as the kind of questions you're being asked?
Yeah, I think we don't measure SDK adoption. We probably should. That sounds like a good idea. Honestly, we just assumed everyone uses them, but I think maybe this is an assumption that needs to be revisited. No, it's really for us about activation rates, like how many people actually send that first webhooks or get to that, integration. We have metrics, what we consider activated. And then the second part is support tickets. So how many people are confused at any point in time? And again, we try to keep that roughly stable.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, in a previous company, we had a really complex authentication schema set up with SSL certificates and all this extra overhead. And when we simplified that and started providing libraries, what we really were looking at is, are we getting higher value questions like, how do I solve this problem and use your API to do it versus how do I even connect to your API and get a successful response? So it sounds like you guys are measuring those kind of support tickets and keeping them at a, what do you say, a maintainable level?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously we wanted to go to zero, but I don't think that's a reachable goal. So I think maintainable level is a good way to put it.
Yeah. And at API Matic, we have a tool and we have our own APIs to generate SDKs and generate documentation and basically while we have a developer experience, we're actually helping our customers build their developer experience. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit about how Svix approaches that similar paradigm where you have your own DX, but you're essentially building part of the DX for your customers and how you are ensuring that you're delivering something that's really great for their communities and their developers.
No, I think that's kind of like a great question, and part of also the challenge of what we do at Svix, which is we kind of like have multiple customers, right? In a way, our customer is the one that pays us and integrates with us, but then we have this whole set of customers that use Svix implicitly, and we want to make sure that they're happy, and we want to make sure that they, because when you integrate Svix, your customers don't know that we exist. I mean, we appreciate it if you tell them, and as many people do. But essentially, that means that if something is good or bad, that would make our customers look, good or bad, depending on the situation. So having an amazing developer experience for our customers, in a way, it's even more important than having a great developer experience for our customers. So we just focus a lot on that. This is much harder to track, though, because we don't always get those, bug reports or confusion because they don't know that we exist. And we encourage our customers to just not worry about any support there, just like, burden us with all the questions there. And we don't get that many. So that's good. But yeah, we try to get all the feedback that we can from our customers. And, you mentioned generating SDKs. We build SDKs for our customers to offer to their customers to make that easier as well.
I didn't realize that. That's really cool. I know when I've interacted with webhooks, I typically have to log into some kind of dashboard where my API keys are, and there might be some place that I go into, like turn on my webhooks, maybe for specific kinds of events, and I might have to generate a secret or something to do some verification. Do you guys offer some kind of embeddable component? Because everyone's got different portal solutions, and I'm just wondering, how do you guys approach that?
Yeah, so we have a pre-built UI that you can just embed in your own UI using an iframe, and that gives your our customers, webhook consumers, gives them the ability to manage, subscribe the event to the specific events, decide which events they want to receive, have full visibility into the whole delivery, so you can see exactly when things fail, why they fail. If they fail, you can retry them both. I mean, they retry automatically, but you can also retry them manually. We give our customers like full control into the whole webhook experience. And again, aiming to be, state of the art and really just having like a great developer experience. And then I don't know how familiar you are with that part, but or how familiar everyone listening is, but usually with webhooks, you do signature verification, you verify the signatures of web deliveries. So we actually worked with a few great companies with Twilio and Kong, Zapier, Supabase, great list of companies. And we worked with them on defining standard webhooks, which is essentially, so before standard webhooks, everyone did webhooks differently. And even great implementations like Shopify and Stripe would just be different. So you would have to, as a consumer of webhooks, you would have to reinvent the wheel, first of all, like always, every time, like build a new integration, but also relearn all the quirks, have a different UI for the configuration. Really, just everything was different. And what we set out to do is just take the best practice. We didn't try to reinvent the wheel and kind of like imagine what we think best is. We actually just took the best practices from everyone, from Stripe, from us, again, from all of those companies, and coded them in a document. And then, we could have stopped there. And I think a lot of people do. We kind of like, oh, we have a spec, and then no one actually follows the spec, or when people follow the spec, they follow it wrong. But what we did there as well is kind of like our same philosophy for the developer experience. We started building libraries that implement it. So in order to be compliant with the spec, it's really just like a line of code for both the receiver and the sender. Kong added support for it. Ngrok, I forgot Ngrok. Ngrok added support for it, and a few other companies as well. So it's really, there's power in community. I think there's power in just a lot of tools working together to achieve, a great experience for people.
Yeah, so I was looking at your site, and it was just about a year ago that you announced this idea of that you're referring to standard webhook. Um, is this like a governing body, or some kind of committee that has established these standards? And are you part of like the Linux Foundation? I'm sort of curious about the genesis of this project and kind of how it's been going for the last year now that you've been out in the public.
So it's very grassroots. There's no, like official organization behind it. It's really just a committee that you see on the website. And also like our approach to it was again a bit different. We didn't write a formal spec with you should do this, should not do that, do this, and all of those. We really just focused on the developer experience, so just like having those libraries accessible, just making it very easy. The path of least resistance is to do the right thing. Just using the tools that we built in the community. We're probably going to standardize it with time, but I think it makes more sense just to focus on adoption rather than having the perfect spec that no one uses. And I think, by the way, this is paying off. I've heard multiple times from people that the requirement is that we be standard webhooks compatible for like people coming to Svix, because that's a requirement they got from some of their customers, which is great. I have no idea, like who started that chain, but just like people demanding that because that's what they know. And that's what they rely on. I think that's great. We just continuing doing that.
Yeah, that's amazing. Is part of the standard webhook, does it include that, I guess I'll call it the development phase, where you're not maybe working with real data and real webhooks, but you need to run tests and do development, some kind of sandbox type experience? Is that part of that as well?
Yes and no. So in the official sense, it's not part of that. And we don't have any definitions for test environments. But it's kind of like going back to developer experience. Standard Webhooks offers multiple tools in order to facilitate the testing and the debugging and all of those. Because again, if you have those tools, this is what you're going to build against. This is what you're going to test against. And that's the best way to ensure that people adopt.
So I'm wondering, where do you commonly see friction when it comes to developers that are adopting Svix?
Yeah. So I think, and I mentioned earlier, like I think one of the things that we do very well is iterating on the docs and iterating on the product and being very careful about everything that we do. So what do I mean by that? I think we talked about it earlier. When someone faces an issue, our default assumption is to assume that they're perfect. They're the most competent engineers we've ever met. They read all the docs back to back, cover to cover. And we probably did something wrong. Either we buried that part of the doc. So like we don't give ourselves an easy out by saying, oh, it's in the docs, right? If it's in the docs, but it's not discoverable.
Yeah. What was the common acronym? RTFM,
Yeah.
right? I totally hear you. It's something we have to fight against, which is thinking that we're the smartest people in the room. Instead, it sounds like you flipped it a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. Because I mean, RTFM, by the way, I've probably used this acronym a lot of times over the years. Like I think it's very valid, but the FM has to be
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
And by good, I mean the fact that you document it. So like if you wrote, like 1,000 pages again of docs, and it's written on page 753, there's like one paragraph that covers this topic. RTFM does not apply. I'm sorry. Like it has to be extremely accessible and discoverable. So we assume they're perfect. We assume they read the docs, but probably we didn't highlight this specific functionality well enough, or maybe it's not explained well enough, or maybe it needs to be referenced from multiple additional places. Maybe we need like a quick start guide. So I think, because of this approach, we've really evolved the product and we've evolved the documentation. So I think those, I want to say they're fairly good. We still see friction there, but we we remove the friction every time we see it. So like I wouldn't say that's the main part. So surprisingly, actually, it's adjacent parts of the experience. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. We use Svix to send webhooks. And let's assume we perfected the API. It's really just like one line of code and everything just magically happens. That's, as good as we can ever build a product. It's not there yet, but it's really as good as it could ever get. But the question is, where do you put that line of code? And when you put that line of code, what parameters do you pass it? Like, what do you want to send as webhooks? And we realize with Svix is that, again, the friction is really just outside the product. Like, how do we enable people to think about designing their webhooks? And how do we enable them to decide which webhooks to send, when to send them, how often, how many webhooks? How do they document their own webhooks? Like, how do they present it to their customers? How do they tell their customers about it? It really just like, there's like vast, again, like corpus of documentation that is essentially serving Svix in a way, because, that's what our customers want to do. They want to do webhooks, but has nothing to do with a product. That's where we still see friction. It just because it's, even if we try to put ourselves in a customer's shoes, it's still very hard to fully imagine the context of where customers come from, because it's so wide, because that's side of the product. I don't know if that was clear.
Yeah, yeah. Well, something you said that really resonated with me is that concept of making the information accessible, because you're right, you could create this amazing, very thorough and comprehensive 1,000-page manual, but how does the developer find the information they need at the moment that they need it? Have you found anything that has been especially effective in helping your developers access the information they need? Any examples?
Yeah, so I would say two things. The first thing would be topical guides. So you're trying to do X. This is a full guide on just doing X, like nothing else. We're not going to veer off. We're not going to we're not going to go on a tangent. It's really just about X. We have links. You can read more about all the topics that we cover. And I think that's been extremely beneficial, because then what happens is that people just look for the use case, and they don't have to look sideways. Everything that they need to know is going to be covered in that flow. And I guess like related to that is, like categorizing things correctly as advanced, or just like structuring the docs in a way that people know their journey. They know where to start. They know where to go from here. They know that if they're just curious, this is, the part that they need to read, and they can ignore this part. So really just like understanding like the journey that we want them to take, and just giving them that. I think that's like one part. And then the complementary side to it is really just keeping things dead simple. Like, I'm a big fan of simplicity. It's much easier to document one API call than documenting 1,000. So what we do, and we do it quite often, is that we have, if you look at like Svix.com and like you look at the docs, you'd see documentation for a lot of, different functionality and a lot of different API calls. We have, I don't know if double, but we have way more APIs than you actually see documented. And we only expose them to customers that actually hit issues that we think, this warrant the use of those APIs. But otherwise, because they're ripe for abuse, we just don't expose them. And we just don't tell anyone about them. We just remove them, because we don't want to confuse people. It's very easy to give people all the knobs that they can twist. 99% of people don't care about these knobs. So like, why even tell them that they exist? Like, we don't need to send them on that confusing journey.
So when you're saying you hide them, does that mean that they're not in the documentation, or they're just sort of set aside from the main flow that people go on?
Not even in the documentation. We have some that are just not in the main flow and would be just like buried somewhere on purpose. Like, if you got there, you earned it kind of thing.
Yeah.
Probably this is what you're looking for. But no, usually we just hide them, fully hide them. You can't find anything about them. And then when we talk to a customer that hits a certain issue, we would just send them a link to like a hidden page of documentation that they can access to use that functionality.
So fascinating. I've not heard of improving the DX by giving them less information up front, and only providing it if it feels like they've really hit a point where they really need to take advantage of some more niche, I guess it sounds like more niche functionality that you guys expose.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's more niche functionality. Sometimes they're really doing something that they shouldn't be doing, but they're insistent. So we just let them do it anyway.
Got it. What belief do you hold about developer experience that you believe isn't really widely held, if we haven't touched on it already?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of did, but I'm happy to elaborate on that a bit further. Its simplicity is one of the, most important functionalities that you can offer to your customers. I guess actually in a way, we talked about it almost at every minute of this call because it applies to docs, right? You want the docs to just help people realize who they are, what they need to do, and how to approach even using the product. It applies to the product itself. You don't want to have like many knobs that are extremely confusing. It really, even support, like it's very easy when you're doing support to just bombard people with information. Just like, okay, so I just heard you asked about X. Here are 7 links. Those are your 7 options. You can go and choose any of them. By the way, each one of them is like half an hour reading and then like 45 minutes of playing around with. That is technically valid support because you're giving them what they're asking for. But really what you want, again, going back to the perspective of the customer, you just want them to help succeed in what they're trying to succeed. So deciding for the customer, like doing the filtering for them and telling them like, hey, I really think this is the link you're after. I think this is what you want to do. If for whatever reason you feel like this doesn't solve your issue or doesn't apply to what you're trying to achieve, let me know and I can offer alternatives instead of just bombarding them with 7 alternatives that are confusing. We're here to help, and making things simple is part of that.
Yeah. Do you foresee in the future incorporating like some advanced search functionality or even AI to help simplify things? Is that something that you guys are thinking about?
So as a founder of a company, you get a lot of cold emails offering you to add AI to your product. And we actually are thinking about it. And there are like some really cool companies that, that offer that, and really cool companies that we respect that sell that. I've been reluctant. And the reason for that, not because I don't think it's good. I do think it probably adds like immense value. I really think AI can make a lot of things better. And I think improved search is definitely one of them, as long as it's, reliable and actually references real stuff and not just like completely made up, like, first generation AI helpers we're doing. But I think there's something about forcing ourselves to kind of like quote, quote, suffer and like have to deal with the questions and like have to, because I think like everything is that if you don't have to pay for it, you're not going to prioritize it, right? So, kind of like going back to my example from like the beginning of the company, I was woken up by support queries. So like the most important thing for me is to prevent support queries, like have to improve the docs to make sure that I don't get woken up. But if all I got was a summary email at the end of the month of like, hey, you got 5,000 support queries, we solved automatically 4,000, whatever, and everyone marked, clicked on the green thumbs up afterwards. In a way, it's better, right? Because people got immediate support and they were happy and all of that. But in a looking at it differently, it actually means that the product hasn't improved. Like we haven't felt the pain, so you know, we haven't made the changes that we need in order to make the product better. So I'm conflicted. That's
Hmm.
the short version.
Yeah. And I wonder, to kind of wrap this back to developer experience, I wonder if you weaken your connection to your customer and there's less community because people
Mm.
aren't joining your Slack group and asking questions and going and finding other interesting information and finding you specifically or your team as a result.
Yeah, I fully agree. One thing that we did as well, we don't use Intercom or any of those tools for a variety of reasons. But like one of them is that I want people to come to the community, ask the question there. Then we're going to have an FAQ just by the virtue of people asking question. Again, not the best maybe way to organize an FAQ, but still like people are going to see that live, question and answers in that channel. Our community, everyone can just jump in. It's not just like, again, this is a support agent, this is a sales agent, and this is we don't have that, we don't have those limitations anymore. So yeah, I think you're right. It's like it fosters that community. And I think that's a big part of a developer experience.
Yeah. Well, I think we've run out of amazing questions for you about webhooks, but is there anything that you want to close with as far as advice for anyone who's thinking about this journey and maybe thinking about webhooks as part of their API program that they're offering developers?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about, and I think it's especially important for API and the products and developer tools is, walking back from what your customers really care about. Like, what do your customers really, really value? Like, for example, one of the things that our customers value is uptime. We've spent an insane amount of time on making sure that we never go down. Why? Because that's a core feature of the product. But it could be that actually for Facebook, it doesn't really matter. Or for, Terraform Cloud or whatever, like any of those products that actually go down often. It doesn't, the customers don't care about. What they care about is new emojis or some other functionality. And I think putting yourself in the shoes of the customer and really just like thinking, I mean, but asking them, by the way, not just thinking in your own thing, but asking them and really just like trying to adopt like a deep understanding of how your customers feel about your product, what they value, what they care about, what they don't care about. And so you can focus on those areas, and you can also empathize with the issues that they face. I think that's the most important thing that you can do when you're designing an API, when working with developing APIs, and really when developing products in general. And that's kind of like, I guess, for like a small plug for Svix, right? That's what we do. So like if you buy into this philosophy, this is what we can offer to your customers and to you. A product built with a lot of empathy to the problem and to the customers that are facing it, focusing on the things you really care about.
That's great. Well, thanks for joining me today. I really enjoyed the conversation and wishing you an amazing 2025.
Yeah, same here. Thank you, Sid, for having me. It was great.
Take care.